See, it all began when I was doing what I usually do, wasting away my life on YouTube, when I, and a significant amount of us, stumbled upon a video by Super Eye Patch Wolf called The Cruelest Video Game. The art style in the thumbnail indicated to me that this was an RPG horror game that had somehow slipped under my radar. You mean to tell me that there was a horror game that I missed, and it was titled The Cruelest of the Bunch? Everyone, get out of my way! It's time for me to watch a playthrough. Yes, I am a coward. Okay, this looks promising, and is that a dead horse?
Rehab was supposed to be a fresh start.
Fantastic! We're already off to a great start. I guess it's time to head inside and... Wait, what's that? Ew! Ew! What is that? Sir? How are we already this hungry? We just ate 5 tomatoes! What is going on? This is the most depressing hedge maze I have ever seen. Hello? There's something about this game that makes it stand out. Some deeper level of horror that isn't as present in other horror RPGs. It's gotten to the point where I close my eyes and I can hear it. Hi, I'm Yasmin, and I like thinking too deeply about things such as music, video games, and, well, anything. And today, I want to talk about fear and hunger, and how the way it immerses and scares the player is not like other girls. She wears short skirts, I wear t-shirts, she's cheer captain, aka why I think this game is so spooky. Woo. I hope to provide a unique perspective not really covered by anyone else, an investigation into the immersive qualities of fear and hunger. I will be honest in saying that no, I haven't played the game. I watched other people play the game and I consumed as much information about the game as possible. And I think this approach actually allowed me to see the game a little bit differently from a typical strategist. I will be using footage from other people's channels. Any channels that I use footage from, I will be linking to in the description, so please check them out. Together, we will embark on a journey, which mainly consists of me falling down a rabbit hole of my own making, to discuss what this game is and why it just hits different. Please know that this is just the opinion of someone who likes to overthink everything. I am aware that I am not very smart. But it's always the dumb ones who never shut up, and so you are stuck witnessing me spiral. You cannot silence me! I know it's already been said, but I'm going to say it again anyway. This game is not for the faint of heart. If you are uncomfortable with mentions of intense violence or inappropriate activities, then...
You need to log off! Jesus Christ!
You have been warned. Fear and Hunger is, according to the official Steam page, quote, a horror dungeon crawler set in the dark and hopeless dungeons of fear and hunger. The game is a hybrid of survival horror and dungeon crawler games, with its influences ranging from Silent Hill to NetHack. There are roguelike elements to the game, as well as a heavy foundation of a JRPG, end quote. That last sentence about roguelike elements and a heavy foundation of a JRPG will be referenced a lot throughout this video. So, in this game, you explore this spooky wooky dungeon in which you get to witness some of the most abominable creations known to man.
What the fuck?
All while trying to not, well, die, I guess. Dying would not be a very good outcome. Though, in this game, I'd say it's pretty much on par with having to see this. Insert joke about this being a Discord mod's basement or something. Fear and Hunger was created by Miro Haverinen, I'm so sorry if I pronounced that wrong, and was released in December of 2018. Yes, this game was made by just one person, so if you need another reason to feel like you have not accomplished enough in life, here you go. You're welcome.
Love Tame Impala, man. Did you know that it's just one guy? Hey, Ben, do you listen to Tame Impala? Listen to this shit, man. Ben, if you had to guess, how many people do you think are in this band?
No, but seriously, this is actually impressive. And this is Haverinen's first game to be sold to the public. Hey, did you know that this game was made by just one person? According to an interview with the developer, the game actually started out as a kind of inside joke at school, where Miro and his classmates would ask each other questions, which eventually evolved into asking questions about what they would do in morally difficult situations in a dungeon. You know, just a typical Tuesday afternoon. Kids will be kids. We really will do anything in class other than pay attention. Anyways, from here it was developed into a video game format, and Miro would eventually write his thesis on it. A thesis which, interestingly, was about the aesthetics and thematics of horror in video games. I tried to look further into this thesis, but I think it's all in Finnish, bar the abstract, which has an English translation. It is a shame, though I was able to get a good idea of what the thesis was about from the abstract alone, so...
Alright then, keep your secrets.
Overall, it helped shape my argument for this video. Fear and Hunger takes place during the medieval times, in the dungeon of Fear and Hunger. Take a shot every time I say Fear and Hunger, game, or RPG. You might die. For this game, you choose to play as one of 4 characters: Mercenary, Knight, Dark Priest, and Outlander. Each character has their own reason for entering the dungeons, however their stories are fairly intertwined. All you need to know is that they're all there in search of a guy named Lagarde, who was recently taken captive in the dungeons. However, once the characters are in the dungeon, they find that the place is kind of gone to They come to learn that it has become corrupted. Stuff has almost certainly gone down. And so it is up to you to descend the dungeon and figure out what the hell is going on. And from there, it's one nightmare after the other. Once your character is chosen, you are given their backstory, and in this you are able to choose between certain details, which will give your character certain traits that may come in handy later on in your playthrough. Obviously, the types of possible traits you can choose from depend on the character you chose. You are then dropped off in the middle of a courtyard, no tutorial, and if you stay too long, a pack of wolves will emerge, engage you in battle, and almost certainly insta-kill you.
What? I just died?
Welcome to Fear and Hunger. The main activities in this game are navigating the dungeon, feeding your party food, collecting loot from barrels, boxes and shelves, managing your sanity, fighting monsters in turn-based combat, feeding your party food, trying to save your game, managing your sanity, crafting items, feeding your party food, managing your sanity. All the while you are following a vague narrative and piecing together lore. And feeding your party food and managing your sanity. Okay, I've been putting this off for long enough. I'm just going to break the ice. This game has a lot of uncomfortable moments and a lot of inappropriate body parts. Like a lot. Like everywhere. Like there was literally an area where there was a not so safe for work, you know what I mean, party going on. Like to the point where mods have been developed for streamers to be able to actually stream the game and for people to just play it without feeling too uncomfortable. Like, you need to understand, when they go low, this game goes lower. It's not like illegal levels of inappropriate, it's just a dark game. Besides, the inappropriateness isn't the scariest part, it's the difficulty. There are different levels of difficulty in Fear and Hunger, and for the purposes of this video, I will not be going into details regarding that. All you need to know is that the difficulty level ranges from difficult to even more difficult. I would just like to begin this by saying, no, the game is not impossible. Hello, and welcome to Watch Mojo, and today we're counting down the countless ways in which this game makes you suffer. Can I legally do this? I don't...
So I am confusion.
I have already mentioned this, but I'm going to say it again. This game has no tutorial. You are dropped in and literally fed to the wolves. Some players argue that overcoming the wolves themselves is the tutorial. Either way, it's a cruel start for this game, with players having to learn through punishment rather than reinforcement. A trait that only persists in this game.
I'm tired of this, Grandpa!
That's too damn bad!
Once you enter the dungeon, you are met with 2 notifications. You feel your sanity decline with every passing moment, and an unnatural hunger begins to drain your strength. And while these just sound like every waking moment of my life ever, these pose a significant challenge in Fear and Hunger. In this game, you have 2 main stats, which are hunger and sanity. These bars will drain throughout your playthrough. The player must find and eat food for hunger, and keep a lit torch and use alcohol and smoking for sanity. Woohoo! Substance abuse! Wow! Failure to maintain these results in starvation and or losing your mind, sending you back to the main menu.
Ricky, when I catch you, Ricky? Ricky, when I catch you, Ricky?
This game has turn-based combat, but that's not all. When you fight monsters, you are not fighting them as a whole. You have to fight their individual body parts. Their arms, their legs, their heads, their Each monster type is different in what part is most strategic to hit. Don't worry though, sometimes the monsters are faced with the same dilemma when fighting you. Uh-oh. Lose your arms, lose your legs, lose your mind. Losing an arm means not being able to carry certain weapons. Losing both means you can't carry any. Yay! Losing one leg makes you limp, and losing both leaves you navigating the world like this. Yay! My dear good sir, you have taken my spleen. The methods to regain limbs are very specific, so for the most part, you're stuck like this for the rest of your playthrough. Yay! Also, if the character you're playing as loses their eyes, specifically gets struck with blindness, this is all you will see for the rest of your playthrough. Gameplay!
They took my eye.
Oh, she passed away? Oh. Alright.
We interrupt this Watch Mojo video for a sponsor. Are you tired of being effective in combat? Introducing the Permanent Debuff. For the low price of fracturing your bones, this nifty addition will lower your stats. Permanently. For the rest of your playthrough. Call 123456789 to break your bones today. If you call now, we will throw in these not so permanent status effects. Bleeding, poisoned, infected, burning, paralyzed, parasites, brain flower, and bleeding from the ass. I'm not joking about that last one. Makes a great gift for friends and family. Call 123456789 to break your bones today. Thanks, Fear and Hunger. These are phobias. Your character can already have one, or you can collect more, like Pokemon. There's even a whole range of different types. Fear of the undead, fear of disease. My personal favorite is panophobia, the fear of everything, like #relatable. If you come across a monster that fits your phobia, you will not be able to dodge their attacks and you're just overall more vulnerable in battle.
On the next level.
Man, these monsters are difficult to beat, more so when playing the game blind, but at least I can gain XP, level up and get stronger. So, where's my XP? Where's my XP? You don't gain any XP from fighting monsters. In fact, you gain little, if any, loot from these battles. There is essentially nothing to be gained from these battles, only something to be lost. Like my foot. Speaking of loss...
That f***ing bird that I hate.
Really, Yasmin? Another monster? Ooh, I'm so scared. It's a bird man. This is the Crow Mauler, described by Super Eye Patch Wolf as, quote, the purest distillation of cruelty in fear and hunger, end quote. After spending a certain amount of time in an area, this notification will pop up, notifying the player that this guy has spawned in. If you run into him, you will engage in a battle in which you are guaranteed to lose party members. This guy is your invincible, scary monster typical of horror games. He can be killed, however he can also use a move called Peck, an unavoidable move that insta-kills a party member by biting off their head. It's mostly advised to try and avoid this guy, but as we established, he is the terrifying presence that often enters the room.
This house is so full of people, it makes me sick.
You know what every game needs? A little bit of Home Alone. There is an array of traps in this dungeon, from booby traps to bear traps. You can even step on a nail and get tetanus. How fun! Both the traps and the previously mentioned Crow Mauler make navigating already explored areas so much more difficult, because you want to get from point A to point B quickly, and so things like the locations of traps and whether or not you're going to run into the Crow Mauler tend to slip your mind until it's too late.
Oh no.
Actually, speaking of navigation, on top of the difficulty, this game is also every gamer's worst nightmare. It is random. Smaller subsections within the overall layout are randomized. Paths closed in one save may be opened in another. The items you collect are also randomized. You collect a bunch of stuff, you die, you go to collect that stuff from the same location again, and it's all different. So forget trying to stick to one strategy. Another thing I noticed was how vague some of the descriptions of items were. Do I take the blue herb or the red herb? Not all items are like this, but still, a good amount of them are. Oh god, I haven't even mentioned the coin tosses yet. Speaking of quirky randomness, a lot of this game uses coin tosses to determine whether something should or shouldn't happen. These things include finding items in chests, dodging a deadly move from an opponent, saving your game, and a bunch of other decisions littered throughout the game. Dude, it is so hard to save your game. You save your game by sleeping in a bed, which are littered throughout the jail cells and such. You can save without risk the first time, but after that it's a coin toss, which if you fail... The beds themselves are very limited, so it's very likely that you will have to take this risk at least once. Or you could be playing the game on a more difficult setting in which you cannot save your game at all. All this randomness means that there are certain aspects of the game that you can never truly rely on. All you can do is hope that you get lucky and that you can make the most out of the luck that is granted to you. May the odds be ever in your favor.
Running! Better start running! 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 Sprinting! Yes! I just gotta keep sprinting!
You can jump down a toilet and get stuck there. Tee. Yeah, party in the shit pit. A place like this would cost approximately $10,000 a month to rent. Maybe the real treasure was the shit pit we fell into along the way. So yeah, this game is difficult and mean. It would take some sick and twisted people to actually put themselves through this agonizing experience. Luckily, the internet is full of freaks.
It's okay, I'll get it. No, wait! We'll use the power of friendship. Oh shit, yo!
Even though the game was released in 2018, it took a while to gain any significant notoriety. I would say that video by Super Eyepatch Wolf really boosted the game, and that video was made in May of this year, 2023. Nowadays, the game has a fairly active fan base, with a thriving community on Reddit, Twitter, and a bunch of other social medias. The creator of the game engages often with the community on Twitter, reposting videos and art. There's also a fan wiki. It's clear that a community has formed to push through the difficulties that this game possesses. One notable development is the amount of YouTube videos that have been created. Videos in which creators have discussed lore, strategies, and their personal takes on the game. This is where I want to make my mark. You see, I grew up watching a bunch of different playthroughs of different horror RPGs. Ib, Witch's House, Mad Father, etc. All of these games had a certain feel to them, but there's something about Fear and Hunger that makes it feel different from these other games. Most have concluded that it's because Fear and Hunger is actually a survival horror immersive sim, rather than your typical RPG horror. Even the creator himself states in his thesis that he aimed for this game to be in the survival horror genre. However, I want to look at this game from the perspective of immersion, and to do so, I will be keeping Fear and Hunger's roots rooted in the RPG genre. Just for now. I do very much understand that this game implements a bunch of survival horror techniques, and that is from the strategist perspective, which has been shared by Super Eyepatch Wolf. I want to look at this from the perspective of how Fear and Hunger manages to accomplish that haunting feeling from within the confines of its RPG elements. Why this game feels like it's looking at you, the player. To do this, we must start at the beginning. What is an RPG and what type of immersion do they present?
Let's start at the very beginning.
RPG stands for role-playing game and is, according to the Cambridge Dictionary, quote, a computer game in which players control the actions of characters in an imaginary world, end quote. RPGs are the byproduct of Dungeons & Dragons. You know, that game where you gather in someone's basement, you make your own Definitely Not Mary Sue OC, and then you embark on a journey with your friends led by the Dungeon Master. As stated by William L. Hosh in his article titled Role-Playing Video Game, quote, early video RPGs generally kept some or all original aspects of D&D, end quote. It is interesting to note that Fear and Hunger started out as a pen and paper RPG, which kind of just sounds like D&D, before being made into a video game. However, when you think about it, the RPG definition sounds a bit vague. I mean, what video game doesn't have you assuming a fictional character's role in a well-defined world? However, the RPG type that I'm referring to is distinguished by the engine upon which these games were made, an engine called RPG Maker, a very to-the-point name. Even though RPGs originated from D&D, it would be the creation of this engine that would set the standards and characteristics for this specific subsection of games. RPG Maker was originally published in Japan of 1987. From here, it would go through a bunch of different iterations. The engine wouldn't come to the West for a long time, which may have lent to a divide between JRPGs and WRPGs. Both have different characteristics. For example, JRPGs tend to follow a predetermined story of one particular character, while WRPGs allowed the player to make their own story. But yeah, the RPG Maker system allowed for everything typical of an RPG, birthing a cool creative community making fun, funky, and fresh games. But what do we mean by typical of an RPG? To clarify what I mean by typical of an RPG, I refer to games such as Corpse Party, Off, AO, Oni, To the Moon, Ib, Palm Gets Wi-Fi, One Shot, Misao, Crooked Man, Witch's House, Mad Father, Mermaid Swamp, Hello Hello, Amori, and Fear and Hunger. These games are united by a specific set of characteristics. RPG Maker games are usually, if not always, 2D. There are 3D RPG games, but RPG Maker usually sticks to 2D. Look at all those pixels! The music often uses loops and is often constantly playing. These practices are reminiscent of older video games before they took on a more subtle cinematic approach. The sound effects are also not as merged with music as typical modern games are, and this is to let the player know that their inputs are being registered because the animations in RPG Maker tend to be a bit limited. So for example, there may be a shaking noise to indicate that you're trying to open a locked door. There is a strong emphasis on exploration in these games, with the player having to search for items to progress, much like how I need to search for my will to live after getting out of my warm soft bed even though I am so comfy. You'd usually have access to an inventory where you can collect and equip items. Not all RPG Maker games have combat, but when they do, it typically is turn-based combat with a leveling up system using XP. The most noteworthy element of RPG Maker games is the story. The games usually require a lot of reading, with text being the main use for details and dialogue. Sorry Jared, you gotta learn how to read. It's interesting how a lot of these RPG Maker games fit in the horror genre, because some of these characteristics would typically be an obstacle when trying to provide a scary horror experience. We are currently in an era where immersion is being prioritized in modern video games, which has resulted in better graphics and the merging of sound and music to provide more seamless transitions. When it comes to providing an engaging experience, making the player feel like they're there, upping the visuals seems like the most effective way to go. And for horror, immersion is everything. To feel like you're actually there, facing the danger. This may provide some reasoning as to why there seems to be less RPG Maker horror games nowadays. Yet, the creation of these games has not fully stopped, and the ones that are created are still well beloved. So how do RPG Maker games provide an effective horror experience?
I'll do anything for you, Mr. Obama, please help!
Anything?
Anything for you, Mr. Obama!
Then perish.
Don't underestimate the power a distinctive art style can have. RPG Maker games tend to embrace their 2D-ness with whimsical settings. Merging art styles can also have an unsettling, jarring effect. And you know what they say, less is more. Sometimes leaving the detailed visuals up to the imagination can be just as effective as HD gore. I'm sure we all know by now just how beloved the soundtracks of these games are. RPG soundtracks are essentially solely responsible for the game's atmosphere, and sound effects provide the game with its realism. With visuals on the back burner, this is where music and sound can truly shine, and with the improvement of technology, both of these can cross over smoothly. Both sound and music, that is. Yes, constant and looping music can cause irritation, but the debate about how much music should be used in video games is a pretty recent topic. I actually did my dissertation on it. I'll just summarize it and say, I think how well beloved this music is tends to speak for itself, and the music aids the game's emotional narratives, something we will get into very soon. RPG Maker games are a goldmine for those who want to explore the power music can have in the gaming experience, including creating unnerving tracks for horror. Stephen Standen, who wrote the article, What Happened to RPG Maker Games, summarizes everything we've said so far pretty well. Quote, what these games did so well was create a horror experience without relying on cheap jump scares or vividly realistic effects to shock you. Instead, RPGs were successful in creating tension by plunging characters into unfamiliar environments and providing a growing sense of dread through their atmospheric soundtracks. End quote. The 2D layout wherein the player explores the world is actually a perfect setup for horror. In Danny Langhoff Nielsen's article, In the Mood for Horror, he mentions that, quote, many horror games use a logical architecture to turn houses, gardens, and streets into great mazes that would make no sense in the real world. End quote. RPG Maker games may be one of the best mediums to create these illogical layouts, and the fixed looking down camera angle could work quite the treat for amping up the tension. Now, this next part is the big one. The characteristic that when done well has created some of the most impactful and most memorable horror RPG Maker games to date. Yeah, it's the story. Where visuals and sound meet their limitations for immersion, narrative carries it through. As Stephen Standen mentions, quote, these games rely more on their stories, often harrowing, to impact you psychologically, leaving you thinking long after the credits roll. End quote. You see, dear friends, it's about the emotional connection that you forge with your character, so the game can rip your character to shreds and traumatize you. And this is not only just done through dialogue between characters. A lot of these games have the characters sharing their thoughts with the player directly. This particular trait, I think at least, is pretty unique to the RPG genre, at least this degree of it. Other games may give characters one-liners or establish things through cutscenes, but RPGs establish a relationship with the player directly. There are exceptions. Think of Ib, who doesn't speak at all, so we have to rely on the dialogue and the description of the world around us to make us root for Ib. Ultimately, it's all dialogue and descriptive text that allows the game to immerse the player. The player is now rooting for their character's survival, so any fear that their character feels is automatically translated over to the player. It's overall a fascinating approach to horror. One can also note that while combat tends to be utilized less in horror RPGs, it can make for a good storytelling method. Think of games like Off and Amori. Overall, RPG games achieve their immersion through creative outside-the-box use of music, visuals, and sound, but even more so with their rich and detailed storytelling and lovable characters. So, what were we talking about again? Oh yeah, Fear and Hunger. We are finally back and able to apply what we learnt about RPGs to Fear and Hunger, discussing what conventional RPG elements Fear and Hunger uses to provide an effective horror experience, and also the elements that do not align with RPG conventions. Perhaps finally answering the question, why is Fear and Hunger scary and immersive in a way that's not like other girls? Fear and Hunger's visuals are definitely haunting. There are several things within this 2D visual layout that are noteworthy. The 2D layout works a treat for Fear and Hunger. This game is set in a corrupted dungeon, so the narrow and dimly lit pathways make the player feel suffocated and encased. The fixed camera angle amps up the tension as one can only see so far down the corridor. There is even use of a logical architecture later on in the game, with the existence of an entire underground city, which isn't impossible, but definitely odd. It just all feels so claustrophobic. The overall art style is very distinctive. This game maintains a dark and dreary color palette. This is actually kind of set apart from other horror RPGs, as they tend to actually use vibrant colors to help make up for the 2D visuals. When Fear and Hunger does implement colour, more specifically this yellow, it looks sickly and off-putting, and they add on this hazy effect on top of it to make you feel as though you're in a fever dream. It's all very unnatural. It's clear that there is no sense of safety to be found in the game's colours.
Black is the color of emptiness. I feel it in my soul because I'm an emotional mess.
As for the monster designs, I think they speak for themselves. Some are just plain grotesque, others are just plain disturbing. This game is rich in lore, so sometimes the mere existence of some of these monsters implies something horrible. Another thing I want to point out is linked back to the inappropriate elements of the game. Please forgive me for saying inappropriate elements all the time. I just don't want YouTube to kill me. I, like many others, am not a fan of including something just for the sake of shock value. However, these uncomfortable things in Fear and Hunger have been argued to have a sense of purpose to them. Miro Haverinen, I'm so sorry if I pronounced that wrong again, the developer, stated in an interview, quote, "Every time I felt bad about making some things, I figured I was on the right path. If it created a repulsive feeling in me, it had to have an effect on the people playing the game too." End quote. While there is a baseline for how low things get in this game, Fear and Hunger is ultimately a game that is doing everything in its power to make you feel uncomfortable. This certainly does amplify the horror experience and makes dying to certain monsters that much more horrifying. However, and I could just be speaking from my own personal values, but I do feel that there are some things in the game that are included just for shock value and not in a necessary way. Though I think that's just my own opinion, and if you're going to have a dungeon filled with corruption, you're going to, well, fill it with corruption. I also think the whole barbaric nature that tends to be linked to the medieval setting does serve to argue in favor of the inclusion of these inappropriate elements. Things were definitely brutal in the past. Moving on. Even the characters you play as look off-putting, with sickly pale skin and these empty eyes staring soullessly at you. It's an excellent use of the uncanny valley. Everything looks off, everything looks dead. In a good way, this art style is nothing short of imaginative and effectively thought out. It most certainly does live rent-free in my brain. Not because I want it to, but because I'm too scared to try and kick them out. I could go on and on about this game's music. Fear and Hunger is one of the first RPG games that I've seen take a more modern approach to its soundtrack, pulling back on predictable looping music and implementing cinematic, subtle music with unpredictable gaps of silence. It also moves smoothly between soft and loud dynamics, aka, in this case, dread and downright terror. There is also an overlapping of sound with music. One example of this is the track called Eastern Wind, where, obviously, as suggested by the title, has these howling winds, yet something is off. This is further implied by this haunting, drowned out chord. It's so well crafted in that it never feels predictable. The chord seems to play at random and the winds grow and lessen in intensity. While the track is constantly playing, the music is not. The drowned out chord could also be identified as something coming from the dungeon, creating this sense of foreboding. Well, look at that. I just fell down one rabbit hole talking about one track. Every track in this game has something interesting to be said about it. I'd love to maybe someday make a video talking about Fear and Hunger's music particularly. There's a channel called Dino Sulik. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, I'm sorry again. They made a video on the music in Fear and Hunger, so I recommend checking that out. For the purposes of this video, I'll just make one more observation. An observation stolen from Super Eye Patch Wolf, but I do have a point to make. You see, the music not only provides the perfect atmosphere for this game, but it also communicates ideas directly to the player, breaking down that fourth wall. One track that the player will become very familiar with is the title track, titled Fear and Hunger. And while I could go on and on about this track, I will just bring everyone's attention to that knocking sound. This knocking sound rings consistently and clearly throughout this track. Typically in RPG games, and probably other games, there is a separation between gamey aspects of the game and the actual immersive narrative itself. A title screen in video games is what a title card is to film. It's a gamey aspect of the game, and it reminds the player that the game is just a game, and through this reminder, they are provided this sense of safety. The player is reminded that they are ultimately removed from the tension and anxiety of the narrative gameplay. However, Fear and Hunger consistently communicates a level of self-awareness to the player, breaking down the boundaries between gamey aspects of the game and the narrative gameplay. You make it far enough into the dungeon, reaching the deepest depths of Fear and Hunger. You are so far from the surface, when all of a sudden, in the track titled Ancient City, you hear this. Some associate this sound with the failures and deaths they experience throughout this game. Some feel that the knocking sound is all-encompassing itself, linked to the feeling of being hungry and fearful in itself. Others feel that it reminds them of how far from the start they are. I think all these interpretations mean the same thing, that Fear and Hunger is aware of the player. Nowhere is safe. When it comes to the combat, it goes without saying that the difficulty definitely makes the game stand out. While I will be investigating this difficulty more in depth, I just want to mention something that Danny Langhoff stated in his article, In the Mood for Horror. Quote, "Fear is the result of the person feeling like the resources available are insufficient to overcome the current situation. Hence, in a horror game, when you have no or little chance of overcoming your enemy, you will most likely experience fear." End quote. there are two kinds of enemies in horror. Ones that you can fight, and ones that you cannot. Both have their strengths and weaknesses when it comes to creating immersion. Enemies you cannot fight involve a lot of running and hiding, and while this is good for terror, you can never really know just how dangerous the monster is, if you get what I mean. Like, you can't look too closely. There's also the risk of making the monster look stupid with your cool, ankle-breaking avoidance techniques.
Get back here!
Listen, in my eyes, you're already on fire.
Where'd you go?
Trying to butter you up
There
a
you
little
are!
bit.
Claire, where'd you go? Claire, she must have gone back up the stairs. Claire. Oh, I guess I'll go back upstairs. Wait a second. You get back here, little lady. Where'd she go?
But on the other hand, allowing the player to fight the monster means that a sense of fairness has to be implemented, weakening the threat and giving the player a sense of control. Overall, lessening the horror effect. RPG Maker Horror tends to use unfightable monsters, so the player must avoid the danger. There are exceptions like Omori and Off, but these games will make up for the lessened terror by placing scary narrative moments within the combat. Fear and Hunger, however, allows the player to fight pretty much everyone. And yet, it does not bend for the player. The Crow Mauler should, really, be the unfightable monster that you have to avoid. But you can fight him. Most of the time, the player will learn to avoid the Crow Mauler. But by allowing them to have a go at fighting him, to try and beat an almost unbeatable monster, or at least a monster that you are very unlikely to walk away from without significant casualties, the player can experience the fear that Danny Langhoff points out. The fear of fighting a monster that you have very little chances of beating. This is yet another unique approach that Fear and Hunger has taken from within the confines of RPG limitations to provide a scary experience. Wow, this game is really rocking it as an RPG. It sits pretty comfortably within the confines, and we haven't even gotten to the most immersive element that RPG games have to offer: the narrative and dialogue. Hello? Alright, we've picked our character and... that's weird. I can change their name, but don't they have canon names? And why isn't the canon name the default choice? Oh well, it's time to enter the dungeon of Fear and Hunger. I'm ready to forge an emotional connection with this character to feel the impact of horrific events. So bestie, how are you feeling? Okay. Nothing? Oh, wait, I have to select the talk option. Okay. Wait, hold on. Are you telling me that I have to go looking for the dialogue in an RPG? I have to go looking for the dialogue in an RPG. I have to go looking for the dialogue in an Okay, well, dialogue seems to be a lot more in your face when talking to a monster in battle or the rare NPC. This is a dialogue that most players will come across throughout their playthrough, so maybe we can get more insight into our character's personality that way. What's that? Most, if not all, dialogue remains pretty much the same no matter what character you choose? Oh, well, what can we say to the monsters? What is your origin? Please don't. Prepare to die. Great. See, that wouldn't be such a big deal if the more personalized dialogue outside of combat wasn't something that I had to go looking for and activate myself. Players could go through this whole game without having any emotional connection to their character because they just never chose the talk to your party option. You have to look for the dialogue. You have to look for the dialogue. Maybe the character we chose is just shy. Yeah, maybe when we get more party members, there'll be plenty of chatter given to us. Hello? Okay, I'm not saying there's no dialogue. There's plenty of dialogue where the player can learn about their character and other characters as well. What is weird about it is how little of it is given to us in a linear narrative way. we have established that RPGs rely heavily on story and dialogue to immerse the player, and not just immerse them, but emotionally invest them. So these games can't just let dialogue sit on the side where the player can just choose to read them or not, at least not to this extent. The dialogue is fed to the player, it kind of has to be, because we want to ensure that the player has connected with their character in order to root for their survival. But Fear and Hunger doesn't feed the player dialogue. I can count on one hand the amount of cutscenes that are in this game, and out of the playthroughs that I watched, none of them went out of their way to select the party talk option. There isn't a linear set of dialogue moments that emphasize a narrative, or at least as much as there should be in an RPG. I'd almost say that it's like the dialogue is part of the lore rather than the narrative, something to be stumbled upon rather than an integral part of the game. It's not just that either. Fear and Hunger engages in a bunch of other storytelling tomfoolery. Oh my god, Fear and Hunger, you're such a crackhead. Right off the bat, something is off. All of these characters have canon names. Kahara, Dercy, Enki, and Ragnarvalder. Yet we are given the option to change their name to whatever we want. We could name our character Master, and that would be their name. I can't believe for this bit I picked the name Master. I actually cannot think of anything funnier than that. My brain has turned to goop. We are then given this character Master's backstory, which depends on the character that isn't Master that you chose. I would also like to emphasize that we are given the backstory. Master doesn't tell us his backstory, it is given to us by this third-person narrator. And this third-person narrator addresses Master as you. You were born with the soul of the tormented. You are destined to struggle in every step you take in life. Damn right I am. Fear and Hunger speaking the truth. This third-person narrator is used throughout the game, but this wouldn't be new. RPG Maker games with silent protagonists will have this third-person narrator telling you things like, the door is locked and your party was victorious. However, that is more linked to game mechanics rather than storytelling. It is odd to have narration in the beginning of the game, because Fear and Hunger's beginning is like a cutscene. It's storytelling. So it's just weird that you have the game telling the story to this character who you named Master, but it's also you. This separation between you, Master, and the character you play as, Ragnarvalder, sticks throughout the game. It doesn't matter who you choose to play as, you're going to be talked to by this third-person narrator as though you were your character, Master, and yet if you search for it, you can find moments of dialogue that reveals the character you chose as, Ragnarvalder's, personality and thoughts. Just to emphasize, if you search for it. I don't know whether to cry or laugh. Me too, bestie. Me too. Or you might also be given glimpses into your character's personality in moments in combat. You try talking to the cave gnome. If you don't search for it, you can learn a lot about the world around you, but very little about your own character's emotions and thoughts. The game is rich in lore, and yet there is not much emotional connection to be had between you and your character. It just feels like, while there's only really one direction to go in the game, descend the dungeon, the narrative feels like a set of separate events linked together by the lore you uncover along the way. It feels more like an open world exploration game. There are no set chapters, no substantial dialogue informing us of Master/Ragnarvalder's ever-changing goals or thoughts or feelings. This openness is further added on to by this game having multiple endings. But even after everything we've discussed, Fear and Hunger isn't a typical RPG Maker game. It implements elements from outside its genre, and the storytelling and dialogue is just one of those parts that somewhat differs from typical RPG Maker games. It's odd though, right? You'd think that out of all the things that RPG Maker games have to offer, you would use one of its biggest strengths to its full capacity. For a horror game, you want to cultivate a scary environment, but you also want to make me root for my character's survival. But at the same time, the dialogue could take away from the terror that this game presents. A terror that sets Fear and Hunger apart from other RPG Maker horror games. So far, I'd say Fear and Hunger accomplishes a lot with RPG conventions, even with the slight differences in storytelling and dialogue. These alone contribute to the game sticking out from older RPG horror. Yet, there is still that terror. that difference yet to be nailed down. I guess this is where we start to talk about the survival horror genre and how Fear and Hunger implements that, as many people have discussed. The main area that the survival horror genre impacts in Fear and Hunger is the mechanics. But why? Why make this game so frustrating? Why make it so random with the coin tosses and everything else? Why turn your back on RPG storytelling and dialogue for this survival horror immersive difficulty? Is it even immersive? Does the developer just want us to suffer? This game is frustrating. This game is too random. This game is looking right at you. After experiencing such a shocking revelation that definitely wasn't in the title or alluded to multiple times already, Yasmin decided to take some time to reflect. Who knows how long she'll be gone, where she'll go, the people she'll see. Will she ever be the same again? Maybe we'll never see her again. Oh, never mind, she's back. I am back. It is the next day. You and your loser friends are going to the cinema to watch the B-movie. Don't look at me like that. Just follow along. Okay, I have a point. I have a point to make, I promise. You get your snacks and sit down in the back. The movie starts.
Turn off the flash, you moron!
And Barry B. Benson starts talking to his friend. You turn to your friend and say, "Hey, this movie makes no sense. Bees can't talk." Your friend turns to you and says, "Yeah, no shit, idiot. Shut up and watch the movie." You sit there baffled that anyone can enjoy this movie when bees can't talk, nor can they express their approval of jazz. Your day is ruined. The end. The suspension of disbelief is referred to by the Oxford Dictionary as, quote, "the concept that to become emotionally involved in a narrative, audiences must react as if the characters are real and the events are happening now, even though they know it is only a story." End quote. There's an unspoken rule that in order for an audience to enjoy a film, they have to put aside what they believe to be real and just enjoy the film, damn it. This rule allows the audience to have fun with film and to emotionally invest themselves in it. Many agree that the suspension of disbelief is simply just a necessary thing. However, some scholars are less approving of it. Some film scholars even use the term in a negative light to criticize certain movies. You know that gap between the audience's opinion and the film critics' opinions on Rotten Tomato? I'd say, well, I think at least, that has a lot to do with the willingness to suspend disbelief. I could go on and on about this topic, but I'll just summarize my thoughts. I believe in the audience's ability to suspend their disbelief. I don't particularly care about realism in film as long as there's something for me to latch onto emotionally, that there is some sort of connection. The bees can talk all they want. This suspension of disbelief also applies to video games, but it functions kind of differently. Mario has to be able to jump unnaturally high. Trying to implement some level of realism into it would take away the fun of it. Mario, no! But also, if Mario was made to jump at a realistic height, the game just wouldn't feel fair anymore. Film and video games both share the characteristics of sound, visuals, and music, but video games have the addition of gameplay, interactivity. And we can argue all we want about how realistic a game should be, but above all else, a game has to be fair to the player. The gameplay needs to be balanced, it needs to be accessible. But you see, dear friends, by having this level of accessibility and suspension of disbelief, there are some things that the player is made aware of. There's an understanding that the game's got a game. Why is this area easier for fighting monsters than this area? Well, the game's narrative might try to explain it because of X, Y, and Z, but we know that the first area was where the tutorial took place, so it has to be easier. The game's got a game. Why doesn't Mario need to stop to eat and sleep during Super Mario Bros? Well, the game isn't focused on that aspect, so the game's got a game. One thing that video games offer is what many in film would refer to as plot armor. In this case, I'm going to call it player one armor. See, plot armor is linked to the narrative. It's unlikely that the main character is going to die early in the film. they've got plot armor. But player 1 armor, as I would call it, is the safety the player has in knowing that if they die, they can just start from their last save again, and their character has to survive most events for gameplay's sake. This safety kind of works against horror in a way, because the player is reminded that the game is just a game, and they are provided safety in the form of the pause menu. But this safety has to be there in order to have an accessible game. Otherwise, it would be like if Minecraft only had hardcore mode. I think the only person that would thrive in that scenario would be Filza. Bless. I would not survive. I don't know about y'all, but I would not survive only hardcore mode in Minecraft. I am a pansy. So, the use of suspension of disbelief in video games is the understanding that for balance and accessibility, the game's got a game. While it would be nice to shove in some cold, cruel realism, everyone say it with me now, the game's got a game. Balance is highly sought after by video game companies because you want to cater to as wide an audience as possible. And if you're going to cater to something more specific, you want to seem as inviting to that specific player base as possible. Sure, mechanical realism could aid the game's immersion, but why do that when you can just improve the graphics and sound? To lessen that accessibility would be a huge risk, especially for a big gaming company. Jesus, I feel like a less accessible game would be a big gaming company's worst nightmare. What kind of lunatic would take that risk? Ladies and gentlemen and those in between, Fear and Hunger took that risk.
God damn it. Right? You died because of your infection.
How?
Okay.
How is this still alive?
Jesus. Oh, son of a
miss.
Last time was heads, so tails.
Damn. It's gross.
Oh god, I'm going to die.
No! There's no save for like 10 goddamn hours.
Last time I did this, it was tails. Now this time it's heads, of course. Still a terrible presence entering these dungeons. What type of terrible
Why is a terrifying presence entered the room?
Oh, for fuck's sake.
Why would he do that? No,
although at this point you've probably seen
Tails. Again, check this out.
So
Super Eye Patch Wolf said, quote, "Wow, f*** this broken game. I hate this. I would rather play literally anything else." End quote. While I was scouring the internet inhaling as much Fear and Hunger content as I could, I noticed something interesting. A lot of the videos that I watched on Fear and Hunger said the same thing, whether it was because of the walls or whatever, that some players, if not many players, would decide that this game is not for them. I mean, look at me! I haven't played the game. I watched other people play the game. I am a coward. Listen, the game is not impossible. It can be done with a good strategy, but one has to admit that this game is not very accessible to those unwilling to suffer. Fear and Hunger is every big gaming company's worst nightmare, potentially scaring off a chunk of players. It refuses to fully rely on the player's suspension of disbelief and implements something that has been referred to as cruel realism. Instead of just saying, the game's got a game, Fear and Hunger makes you feel the consequences of your mistakes and the injustices of this particular setting. Rather than going down the predictable path of just using realistic graphics to create more immersion like other big gaming companies would, Fear and Hunger not only makes its mechanics more realistic, but also cruel. This game essentially says, you idiot, of course Mario can't jump that high. And this cruel realism, though a sacrifice, is what makes the game feel like it's looking at you. It makes the game feel like it's aware of the player. And this is the horror that hits different from the other RPG Maker games. Throughout our investigation into RPG Maker games, we discovered what really makes them work in the horror genre, despite seemingly possessing traits that would work against certain levels of immersion required for said horror. Overall, we have looked at how RPG Maker games have come to master their visuals, sound, music, and most of all, narrative. And these actually parallel film. In fact, RPG Maker games almost feel like books with a touch of visuals and sound. With such an emphasis on these particular qualities, we have overlooked something that separates video games from film in the first place: interactivity. And RPGs in particular are very transparent about interactivity. RPGs are very gamey. There are numbers and stats everywhere. You can see how much experience you gain from fighting monsters, and you can see how much you're leveling up. You can often see the amount of health the monster you're fighting has, and you can see how much that health increases as you progress further into the game. Find items, see extensive descriptions of said items, equip items and see how much they raise your stats. Numbers and bars everywhere. Am I saying that all RPGs have these qualities? No. But if you're going to hold back on visuals, you best believe that you're going to either incorporate narrative involvement or competitive involvement. Or both. We have emphasized how much RPGs rely on narrative involvement to provide immersion, an element that is the foundation of film. With this reliance on stories, we have overlooked what can be done with interactivity, the foundation of video games. Because even though RPG Maker games have their limitations, they are very transparent with their mechanics. Fear and Hunger injects cruel realism into its mechanics, and because mechanics are at the forefront of RPGs, it creates a deeper level of immersion.
Well, he looks at me, and I look at him.
Hello, and welcome back to Watch Mojo, and today we're counting down the countless ways in which this game makes you suffer. #Woke Edition. What do the aforementioned difficulties achieve when looked at from the perspective of immersion? Just to clarify, when I refer to cruel realism, I am talking about the specific placement of survival horror techniques into the mechanics of the game. Are all these difficulties linked to the survival horror genre? No, but most of them are, and those that are not will also be explained. And just to quickly note what survival horror actually is, according to the Survival Horror Wiki, quote, "Survival horror is a subgenre of action-adventure video games that emphasizes vulnerability, resource management, and puzzle solving in a horror-themed environment." End quote. Firstly, there is no tutorial. Why would there be a tutorial? You are here, in this real setting, about to enter a dungeon. Realistically, we wouldn't tell you how to walk or how to pick up items. You kind of know how to do that from birth. What do you mean this is a video game? You think we're going to remind you that you're just playing a game? This is an immersive horror experience. Being dropped in like this maintains the player's feelings of dread and uncertainty. The tone is never interrupted by a gamey aspect of the game. Secondly, our sustenance and spook meters are constantly draining. It makes sense to have a meter for hunger and sanity in a place like this. And from what Fear and Hunger describes, these meters are being drained faster than normal because of the dungeon's corruption. This tactic makes the player more aware of the passage of time. Other horror RPG games don't employ this level of urgency, and so players find safety in being able to take their time. Fear and Hunger eliminates this. Realistically, you are a person who needs to eat, and you would become a little bit kooky after witnessing so many abominations in the dungeon. And this constant need for items to supplement the situation makes the player feel constantly underprepared, and thus never fully able to relax. This overwhelming use of resource management is classic survival horror. Thirdly, fourthly, fifthly, sixthly. I'm grouping these together because they all belong in the same category, which is combat, in which limbs on both sides can be lost, you can be afflicted with a permanent debuff, or you can get a list of not so permanent debuffs, and you can have phobias. You're all gonna hate me by the end of this, but realistically, if you're going to fight someone, then yeah, you are going to have to pick a part of them to hit. You can't just hit someone as a whole. And these are giant, strong monsters with very dangerous weapons. If you're not careful, then yeah, you are going to lose a limb. And yeah, losing your eyes would make you blind.
Them's the brakes, pal.
And if your limbs get broken, then you would become weaker.
Them's the brakes, pal.
A game that prioritizes balance and relies on suspension of disbelief would hold back on these details. But Fear and Hunger doesn't hold back. It has cruel realism. These additions add an unavoidable vulnerability to battles, typical of survival horror. It doesn't matter how prepared you are, you will still feel the anxiety of potentially losing a limb, and in these dangerous dungeons, limbs are vital to survival. So you don't just charge into whatever battles whenever, there are real consequences for getting into these battles with these monsters. The player must strategize and pick their battles wisely. I already mentioned this, but once again, when the player feels as though they are unlikely to overcome the monster, they are likely to experience fear. Much like your character. Who wouldn't pick up a phobia or two down in these depths? Is the combat system frustrating? Yes. Terror-inducing? Also yes. Seventhly, no XP for you or me. Survival horror typically doesn't have XP. I'm gonna say it. You can't stop me. You really thought you were going to get stronger through some non-existent numerical system? Grow up. What is this? A video game? This is an immersive horror experience. But this also ties into the combat system and the likeliness of overcoming these monstrosities. You can never get too comfortable. Eighthly. Nothing like an almost unbeatable Birdman to keep you on your toes. If, even after everything we've discussed, you manage to somehow get comfortable, the Crow Mauler will be there to humble you. Ninthly. Okay, this edition may feel like the game is just messing with you, but I also think this is another way in which the player is kept in check. The game is aware of how players explore these layouts, so the use of traps and the Crow Mauler keep already explored areas unsafe. So you cannot rush through them as other players would. You've got to stay vigilant if you want to survive this dungeon, and you never know what is lurking around the corner. Which, speaking of, 10thly, 11thly. This particularly cruel addition is going to do two things to your video game. 1. Frustrate people, and 2. Turn this video game into a more immersive horror experience, so also scare people. Making things random guarantees a fresh playthrough every time. Players will not be able to rely on the safety or predictability found in loading an earlier save. The items are different, the layout is unique, because realistically, this is your first time exploring this dungeon. What do you mean when you die you can reload from a previous save? This is an immersive horror experience. There's no safety to be found here. This is real life. And much like real life, certain things are just left up to luck. By taking away control from the player, they can be left feeling helpless in their situation. This is added onto by the lack of times you can save in this game. What better way to implement horror than to take away one of the few gamey aspects of the game that makes the player feel safe? It's also unpredictable, and the game having multiple endings solidifies that this is the player's own unique experience.
Sitting, bleeding.
Don't jump down toilets, idiot. All of these elements, once seen as mere obstacles, work together to provide a horror experience not like other RPG horror games. This element doesn't amp up the narrative like the visuals and sound would. Instead, it works with the player. And so, by sacrificing accessibility for cruel realism, this game gets to say, hey, you're playing me, but I see you. From the beginning, I wanted to approach this game from the perspective of the RPG maker genre, because at least to me, it seems that Fear and Hunger sets its roots in the RPG genre with its visuals and layout, etc. The RPG genre makes up for what it lacks in terms of immersion by connecting the player to the characters and story. Fear and Hunger makes up for a lack of immersion by implementing survival horror mechanics. Fear and Hunger then works creatively with RPG characteristics to reach out to the player. For example, the knocking sound in the title screen that we mentioned before. This game is less focused on creating an emotional connection between you and your character and more on breaking boundaries. So to summarize, Fear and Hunger takes a specific genre, the RPG, in which narrative is most prominent, and then injects survival horror, aka cruel realism, into its mechanics. So we go from this 2D experience with dialogue and narrative between characters and turn to face the player, creating more dimension and involvement. The focus is now shifted to the player, and with that, you realize that it isn't just your character that is stuck in this dungeon. You are stuck in this dungeon. This was hinted at by the way Fear and Hunger narrates and involves dialogue, the ability to change your character's name, the third-person narrator directly addressing you, the basic dialogue options, and the multiple endings. All of these work to pull the player in, rather than fully relying on having this personality-rich character navigating the dungeon for the player to emotionally invest themselves and for them to cheer them on. Fear and Hunger says, you are stuck in this dungeon. You may be playing a character that has their own backstory and canon lore, but the game is once again demonstrating their awareness of the player. It gives you the lore of your character at the beginning and places it on a shelf and puts you on the center stage. I think that's why chunks of dialogue that reveals our character's personality are essentially optional. We have to want to read it. We have to seek it out. Your character's backstory and thoughts throughout this journey are lore rather than narrative. You yourself occupy the space that your character would have, so whenever the character you control has to make a difficult decision, it weighs heavy on you because you are the one making this decision. And you are, in this way, more in tune with your character and feel responsible for their survival. This is how Fear and Hunger emotionally invests you in your character without fully relying on dialogue and narrative. And guys, this is where the horror really starts to hit. The scary elements and overall narrative just seem so much bigger and more intimidating. It's as Super Eye Patch Wolf says, it makes you feel true dread and makes the victories that much more impactful. The constant uncertainty of what's waiting around each corner. In this dark and claustrophobic dungeon, your resources are always depleting and your anxiety always increasing. The further you get without saving, the more you have to lose. The monsters never stop being threatening, and the Crow Mauler is unrelenting. Then on top of that, there's the hidden narrative in which you are subjected to what I would describe as some level of Lovecraftian horror, dealing with the effects of unmerciful gods with power and grandeur beyond human comprehension, leaving you with existential thoughts of the constant repetition of human history and whether it means anything in the end when even the oldest gods have abandoned us. Woohoo! Personally, I would say if you enjoyed the hardship, the lore and overall experience is worth it. But take that as a grain of salt from someone who has not played the game. Nothing will make you feel as big-brained as coming up with and successfully executing strategies. Or at least watching someone else pull it off, lol. And you gotta appreciate the amount of detail in the world building, shaping an interesting narrative once you start to put the pieces together. Even now, I'm still learning new things. What the hell is a demon baby? Another thing I barely mentioned was how this game hits harder because it simply subverts RPG expectations with the survival horror techniques. Things that you expected to work, such as gaining XP ultimately failing you, adds that extra oomph of helplessness. It just feels so jarring and wrong, which is great. And so, I finally think I nailed down why Fear and Hunger is spooky and immersive in a way that is not like other girls. This game is not like other RPG Maker games, and though this is somewhat unsurprising given that we already know that this game uses survival horror techniques, the fascinating part is the risk and the effect of choosing to approach immersion in this way. Fear and Hunger is truly the RPG that would do anything in its power to scare the player.
It's really cute that you're gonna defeat me with the power of friendship and all, but again, I am the devil from the Bible, so...
Remember guys, a sacrifice is still a sacrifice, and the sacrifice of this game is that it's often a frustrating and difficult experience. However, it's interesting to note in what way Fear and Hunger is difficult, because it's a lot less difficult if you go in already knowing some of the lore and strategies of the game. When I was watching Let's Plays of this game, I noticed how many of them would specify in the title or in the first episode that they were going into this game blind, as if knowing the game's strategies and lore going in is the norm, that it's kind of a given you search up some of the techniques before playing the game. Did you know that in Fear and Hunger you can come across extra coins, and if you hold down the shift key you can flip 2 coins at once, doubling your chance of success? You didn't? I'm not surprised. The game doesn't tell you this, ever. Let's be honest with ourselves. How often do we search things up online, like how to beat a certain level or a boss? And can you blame us? It's almost like some games want us to do that. Whether it's a super hidden secret like clicking tiles on a wall or finding super hidden collectibles, the game will often reward the player with something like a true ending for engaging in something that requires them to reach out to online communities for help. There are just some games that require multiple approaches from multiple perspectives, which requires multiple people to play the game. And guys, let's just be for real right now. We cannot underestimate the gaming community's ability to torture itself. Do y'all remember the game Getting Over It? The ending isn't even that substantial, and yet I have seen players scream over it. What about Cuphead? Hell, Elden Ring is pretty feckin' tough, along with the other Dark Souls games.
Why'd you kill that guy?
Motherfucker, kill
killed himself!
Fear and Hunger somewhat relies on all this to allow for the inclusion of its difficulty. This game relies on the strength of the gaming community and their ability to band together and share tips. It was able to take the risk of being cruel and realistic because someone somewhere out there was going to speedrun it, or learn everything about it. Looking at you for Polo94, I both applaud you and cower in fear. For every game, a community of weirdos form. Fear and Hunger is essentially like, figure me out, all of you. This is a challenge to be shared. However, after everything I've said, all the praise I've given, is this game perfect? Unfortunately, no. This game has a bunch of bugs and a bunch of other truly unfair additions, such as the game freezing. Some of these glitches unintentionally help the player. There's even an area where the player can stand and collect an infinite amount of extra coins for coin tosses. Polo94, which I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, made a video discussing these glitches more in depth. In fact, his entire channel is dedicated to Fear and Hunger content, so I recommend checking it out. While the unfortunate soul may thank the stars and heavens above for making their gaming experience that much more easier, things like this totally break the immersion. There are other notable complaints, one being how, about halfway through the game, the player is given access to a bed where they can save an infinite amount of times with no risk. Obviously, this depends on the level of difficulty that you're playing at, and while this game is difficult in other ways, players feel that this fully reliable save point takes away from the experience that this game is trying to create. I will also throw in that my feelings towards what I deem to be often unnecessary, uncomfortable moments in the game used for shock value is also shared by other players. I understand the argument for the inclusion of these things, but I also understand the argument against it. So, it is ultimately up to the player to determine whether the game is a worthwhile experience or not, despite the glitches. Nevertheless, it is still really impressive that this game was made by just one person. Hey, did you know that this game was made by just one person? Was everything I talked about regarding Fear and Hunger the use of cruel realism to boost immersion and look at the player from within the confines of an RPG, ultimately sacrificing balance and the belief in the strength of the gaming community that they would pull through anyway, done on purpose? Probably not. Was this Miro Haveren's, Grand Master Plan? Probably not. I mean, maybe some of it was intentional, but all of it? Highly unlikely. But intentional or not, it would be dumb to write off these cool things just because they might just be a happy accident. Some of the coolest effects and breaking of boundaries are done unintentionally. But one thing's for certain, if Fear and Hunger was made by a big gaming company, it would not have made the sacrifices that it did. Fear and Hunger was initially made for a school project. It was what the developer based his thesis on. It wasn't made to be marketed to the masses. It was a game initially created to explore horror. While this goal may have changed into creating a marketable game when it was being sold to the public, it was a game that initially started out not looking for popularity, unlike mainstream games. This is why I think indie developers are so cool. By this developer simply having goals that are different to the norm, they broke boundaries that big gaming companies would never dare to. I think Miro Haverinen, being one of us, a member of the gaming community, allowed him to apply that knowledge when he was making his game. Perhaps some unconscious belief in the strength of the gaming community. This is just my speculation, but it is cool to think of the potential that games have just by having a developer that has different goals, or having a developer that is just more connected to the community itself. Breaking boundaries and creating unique gaming experiences. Fear and Hunger, in this case, highlights the potential that RPG Maker games have in the horror genre. Do I think more games like Fear and Hunger should exist? Yes and no. I still love RPG Maker games that rely on narrative and dialogue. And with the gaming genre being as wide as it is, there is definitely room for both. Games that stick to what works and games that find other ways that work. Fear and Hunger is yet another example of how creativity and potential exists in the indie genre. Support indie developers, y'all. They truly are the best of us. If you somehow made it this far, I hope you enjoyed and somewhat understood my insane rambling. This is, unfortunately for you, going to become a common theme for this channel. Feel free to let me know your thoughts on Fear and Hunger. Do you agree with me, or are you currently in the process of flipping a table over my very misguided thoughts? I would love to know where you stand on this topic. Even now, I still find out new things about the game. Please remember that I have small brain, I'm stupid, and I'm not very smart, so please don't be offended by anything I said in this video. I did as much research as I could, and even then, I understand that I operate on one singular brain cell. You know who doesn't operate on one singular brain cell? All the channels that I mentioned and referenced throughout this video. Please check out the creators, they are insanely talented and cool. Also, please support indie developers, check out Fear and Hunger. Whether you buy the game or you watch someone else play it, it is certainly an experience. And if you like to torture yourself, much like Fear and Hunger's fanbase, consider subscribing. I don't have super high expectations for how this channel is going to go, but damn it, I'm going to chase my manic pixie dream girl dreams, so deal with it, I guess. Until next time, stay safe and don't be too silly. Bye!